Questions without notice. The Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My questions to the Prime Minister. Both sides of parliament support gas export controls.
Members
Despite
on my right.
the Deputy Prime Minister, as Minister for Resources,
Leader of the
having the
Opposition,
power
resume his
to do—
seat. Leader of the Opposition, resume his seat. Members on my right. The member for Goldstein. Members will cease interjecting. The Minister for Immigration and Border Protection. The Minister for Health is warned. The Leader of the Opposition will begin his question again.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is still to the Prime Minister. Both sides of parliament support gas export controls. But despite the Deputy Prime Minister as Minister for Resources having the power to do so, the government has refused to make the necessary ministerial determination. Is the government refusing to act because of the serious legal risk that the Deputy Prime Minister's ministerial actions might be challenged in the courts? Why are doubts about his deputy standing in the way of lower power prices for all Australians?
The Prime Minister has the call. Prime Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, the cheers from the opposition benches cheering on the member for Port Adelaide's confession. I think it's very important to encourage people to fess up. He confessed. Normally confession is a private sacrament.
Member for Griffith is warned.
The honourable member did the
The
right
member for
thing,
Griffith
and he
has
owned
been
up.
warned.
Mr Speaker, really? I mean, this wins the prize for gall from the Leader of the Opposition. This is the man who was a minister in a government that was warned that allowing unrestricted exports from the East Coast would result. They were warned more than 4 years ago.
Members on my left.
And they took no notice. And Mr Speaker, this opposition in government failed the Australian people. And what they did was let the Australian people down, and then the member for Port Adelaide did not tell the truth about it. I'm afraid he didn't. He was asked by Barry Cassidy back in April whether he got plenty of advice back when they were in government in 2012 that the surge in exports would lead to these problems. And what the member—
Prime Minister will resume his seat. Members on my right. The Manager of Opposition Business.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. On direct relevance, the question asks why the Deputy Prime Minister has not used a power that is available to him.
The Manager of Opposition Business will resume his seat. I'll address his point of order in a second, but he has given me the opportunity to warn members about the obvious level of noise in the chamber. I'm not going to keep repeating myself. I will simply eject members. The level of noise is far too high. The member for Griffith has already been warned, and those who have been regularly warned should be on standby to leave the chamber if they're going to disrupt it. On the point of order to the Manager of Opposition Business, he's right, that was an aspect of the question, but the preamble related to energy policy, and I refer him to my earlier rulings. The Prime Minister is in order.
Yes, thank you, Mr Speaker. Well, I can only say, Mr Speaker, to the Manager for Opposition Business, who is chairman of the Opposition Tactics Committee, that the time to save the Leader of the Opposition from that catastrophic question was before he put it into the pack. Too late now. So, getting back to the confession from the member for Port Adelaide. He said we didn't get any advice. But of course, Mr Speaker, they did. From AEMO, from the Energy White Paper, and then finally, of course, he finally fessed up under interrogation from David
Member
Spears.
for Sydney
now,
is
this
warned.
is what we've done, Mr Speaker. What we've done is we have foreshadowed the controls we are going to put on gas exports, and what we have seen is wholesale prices have already declined. Exactly. Short-term prices, on average across the country, $8.61 a gigajoule in July, compared to just under $12 a year ago. Prices have fallen in all East Coast markets. Honourable members will have seen additional gas is coming onto the market. Our policy is working, and when all of the material is together, the minister will make the appropriate declaration, fully informed when he does.
The member for Chisholm.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister update the House on what the government is doing to put downward pressure on energy prices and ensure reliability, including in my electorate of Chisholm? Is the Prime Minister aware of any threats to the government's approach?
Members on my left, the Prime Minister has the call.
And Mr Speaker, honourable members know that the government is focused on the issues that matter to Australians: jobs and the economy, national security, energy security. Everything we're doing is aimed at putting downward pressure on energy prices and ensure that families and businesses can get affordable and reliable electricity and energy. Now, Mr Speaker, we have already secured a better deal for thousands of Australian families from their energy retailers. I heard the Leader of the Opposition mocking that today. Can you believe that? A $400 or $500 or $600 a year saving, that's a laughing matter for him. That's a laughing matter for him. A trivial sum of money, apparently. It's a big deal, Mr Speaker, for thousands of Australian families since our meetings with the energy retailers, since the profile we gave this issue. There have been over 300,000 visits to the Energy Made Easy website, and as honourable members would be very well aware, there are thousands of examples of Australians getting reductions in their energy bills because they were paying too much. So that's right there in the here and now. Gas prices. I've just spoken about the mess the Labor Party left us into and took a long time to tell the truth about. Now, but what we have done is already we're seeing wholesale gas prices come down. And Mr Speaker, in terms of a medium-term measure,
member for Perth
one
will
of
leave
the
under
important things the Labor Party could do if they were fair dinkum about energy prices is support our reform to abolish limited merits reviews. That's already come through the House. My recollection is they didn't oppose it, and instead of passing that rapidly through the Senate, so that the big energy companies, the Leader of the Opposition was so strong in his criticism of this morning. He was a lion on AM this morning about the energy companies, but a pussycat when he was in government a few years ago.
Member for McEwen, he's warned.
Yes, but anyway, what he could do long-suffering consumers a favour. He could ensure that that bill goes through the Senate, and then the owners of the networks will not be able to game the system by taking appeals from the energy regulator, because we know the consequence of those appeals has invariably been to impose billions of dollars of extra costs on consumers. So Labor has to decide, Mr Speaker, whether they are going to get to support us as we support the Australian public for more affordable and more reliable electricity, or continue on their ideological and idiotic approach to energy, a price that Australians are still paying too high a price for.
The Prime Minister's time has concluded. The member for Port Adelaide.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Power prices have never been higher than they have been under this government, and the Prime Minister used to acknowledge that the fastest way to bring down power prices was to act on gas. Is the reason the government has refused to make the necessary ministerial determination to put gas export controls in place because there are serious legal doubts about any ministerial actions from the Deputy Prime Minister? Are doubts about his deputy standing in the way of lower power prices for Australians?
The Minister for the Environment and Energy. The Minister for the Environment and Energy will cease interjecting. The Prime Minister has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. Well, it's good to see the member for Port Adelaide front up again and offer his apologies for his shameful conduct, his party's shameful conduct in government. They can wave They can wave
Prime
around
Minister
their
will resume
fingers
his
as much
seat.
as...
The Prime Minister will resume his seat. The Prime Minister will resume his seat. I've warned the member for Sydney several times she can leave under 94A. The Prime Minister has the call. The member for Sydney needs to leave immediately. The level of noise is far too high. I will lower the volume in this manner if it continues. I'm not going to have members, no matter how senior, be warned and continually ignore me. If anyone has any doubt they've been warned, they could approach the clerk's table. Prime Minister has the call.
Yes, thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, the coalition, under the leadership of the member for Warringah, was elected 4 years ago. And during that time, we have seen the carbon tax abolished. We have seen action on energy prices. We've seen action on schools. We've seen action on industrial reforms. We've seen action on national security. But what we saw, the failures we saw under Labor, resulted in a 100% increase in energy prices under the Labor government. And most recklessly of all, Mr Speaker, what we saw under Labor was a rush into renewables without any backup or any storage. Now, Mr Speaker, the Leader of the Opposition said today, he said the coalition has an ideological objection to renewables. Mr Speaker, the objection we have is to Labor stupidity, Labor incompetence, Labor complacency, the stupidity of a party that, despite warnings from the regulators, from the energy market operator, that allowing unrestricted export of gas from the East Coast would result in tighter supply and higher prices, did nothing to protect the Australian domestic market. Nothing at all. And now we are having to take unprecedented measures to restrict exports to defend Australian consumers and businesses that were abandoned by Labor. But, Mr Speaker, it gets worse. Labor failed to recognise that the wind doesn't blow all the time and the sun doesn't shine all the time. You'd think they might have picked that up. They might have picked that up. But so, more renewables replacing dispatchable baseload coal-fired power, and what's been the result? A shortage of dispatchable power. And so once again, that failure of policy under the Labor Party, enhanced and amplified by Labor state governments, is being cleaned up by the coalition. We are the ones taking the tough decisions to ensure that Australians have affordable and reliable energy. Across the House, Mr Speaker, that is the party of blackouts. That is the party of unaffordable electricity. That is the party that puts manufacturing workers out of...
The Prime Minister's time has concluded. The member for Parkes.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. Will the Treasurer update the House on what yesterday's national accounts tell us about the better days ahead for rural and regional Australia, including for my electorate of Parkes?
The member for
and is the Treasurer aware of any alternative approaches that would jeopardise the prosperity of regional communities?
Treasurer has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Parkes and all the rural and regional members on this side of the House, of which there are many, Mr Speaker. They will all be very pleased to know that in the national accounts yesterday, agricultural growth in production over the last year was 22.6% up, Mr Speaker, and that the value of agricultural exports was up 18.6% in the national accounts. And in today's trade balance figures, the value of rural exports was up 24% higher than last year, Mr Speaker. And on this side of the House, we know we need to continue to invest in rural and regional Australia to drive that growth across the rural and regional towns right around the country. And that's why I was with the member for Parkes a fortnight ago in North Bourke, where, as part of the $200 million Building Better Regions program, we have a $10 million investment in the small animal abattoir in North Bourke, which has leveraged $60 million in investment in what is the biggest investment in Bourke in 2 decades or a generation, Mr Speaker. Now that type of investment is driving 200 jobs in North Bourke from March of next year. This is real investment going into real rural and regional Australia, as is the entire Building Better Regions program right across rural Australia. But it's not just that, because the accelerated appreciation we have put in place for fencing, for dams, for tanks, for silos, and all of these important investments for rural and equipment right across agricultural Australia is driving that growth, and as is the small and medium-sized tax cuts for businesses, which the Labor Party would reverse if they ever get the chance for the Leader of the Opposition to slither into the lodge, Mr Speaker. He would reverse those tax cuts. He would reverse those tax cuts and punish agricultural producers and small businesses all around the country. Now, the alternative, there is no alternative economic plan for rural and regional Australia from the Labor Party. What we have is the no-coal coalition of the members for Hunter, the member for Patterson, the member for Shortland, the member for Newcastle. They think turning off coal-fired power stations in the Hunter Valley is going to be a good plan for regional and rural Australia in the Hunter Valley, Mr Speaker. This is the same member for Patterson who walked into this place with a miner's lamp in his maiden speech, and now he wants to snuff that lamp out as he wants to snuff out. Well, I apologise. There's more than one miner's lamp champion on that side of the House. So why do you want to snuff them out? And why do you want to shut down coal-fired power stations which have put your constituents in jobs, Mr Speaker? They want to snuff out coal and they want to snuff out jobs in the Hunter.
The Leader of the Opposition has the floor.
Before I go to my question, Mr Speaker, on indulgence, I just wonder, there's been a pretty important High Court decision.
No, the Leader of the Opposition will come to his question or resume his seat.
Okay.
He's not a reporter for the High Court. Members on my right, I've already cautioned the Minister for Immigration and Border Protection. He is warned as well.
I note the High Court's decision moments ago in relation to the Prime Minister's $122 million postal survey on marriage equality. Will the Prime Minister work with the community to show his active support for marriage equality? And will the Prime Minister now accept my invitation to write a joint letter to every Australian to support voting yes in the survey?
The Leader of the House will cease interjecting. Members on my right, the Prime Minister has the call.
Well, Mr Speaker, the Leader of the Opposition must be relieved that the promise he gave to the Australian Christian lobby in 2013 is now being delivered by the coalition. He went there to the Australian Christian lobby and he said, I think every Australian should have their say. He did. I mean, I assume that was his heartfelt conviction, or was he simply telling people what they wanted to hear? You know, Mr Speaker, I fear it may have been the case that he was just being his old disingenuous self, telling people what they want to hear. And here he is now, having done everything he could in this parliament to stop Australians having their say. Much to his disappointment now, every Australian will have their say, and that is as it should be. And we encourage every Australian to vote in this survey, to have their say. And, Mr Speaker, as I've said, in this House and in many other places, Lucy and I will be voting yes, and I'll be encouraging others to vote yes. But, Mr Speaker, above all, I encourage every Australian to have their say because, unlike the Leader of the Opposition, I respect every Australian's view on this matter. And I thoroughly reject the way in which he has sought to vilify and demonise people who have a different view to him. This is a great example where every Australian can have a say, and we can, as a Commonwealth of Australia, embrace this important social change, consider it, and make a decision.
Prime Minister resume his seat. Prime Minister resume his seat. The member for McEwen will withdraw that remark, and he'll now withdraw from the chamber. Member for McEwen, you better be very careful what you say. You know the rules very well. The Prime Minister will resume his answer. He's concluded his answer. The member for Melbourne.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Immigration, and it concerns the fate of over 700 men in the Manus Island camp, most of whom have been found to be refugees. 2 weeks ago, the PNG Attorney-General said his country would not allow you to simply close the detention centre on 31 October and leave the men behind for PNG to look after. And it's been revealed in the Senate that last Friday you flew to PNG to meet with Prime Minister O'Neill to discuss the crisis. Have you struck a deal with PNG? If so, what's in the deal, and in what country will the men be resettled? Or is your plan just to leave these men in limbo, create a powder keg situation and then use force and violence against them?
The Minister for Immigration and Border Protection.
Well, Mr Speaker, I thank the honourable member very much for his question. He asks, what is our plan? Our plan is to clean up the mess created by the Greens and Labor. That is our plan. This government, Mr Speaker, this government did not put people on Manus and Nauru, but our job is to get them off, and get them off we will. We've struck a deal, as you're aware, Mr Speaker, with the United States, and I acknowledge the work of the Prime Minister, then President Obama, as well as President Trump as well now, that we can move people as a priority, the women and children, off Nauru, and in a secondary way the people off Manus. Now, we've announced that we want to close Manus by the 31st of October. We are on track to do that, but we will continue to work with the PNG government, because ultimately the PNG government, under the arrangement signed by Mr Rudd, the then Prime Minister, and Prime Minister O'Neill, the arrangement was that those people would stay on Manus, and those people that had been determined to be refugees under the deal struck by Labor and the Greens and the PNG government is that those people would stay in PNG. I just remind the member of that question, of that aspect of his question. And so the fact is, Mr Speaker, we will do whatever we can, not only to get people off, but most importantly to make sure that we don't have new boat arrivals. Now, since the commencement of Operation Sovereign Borders, we have turned back 31 boats. Had those 31 boats got through, we would be dealing with the same mess that Labor presided over when they were in government. That is 50,000 people arriving on 800 boats, and to the great detriment of the reputation of the member who asked this question, I might say, 1,200 people drowned at sea on his watch. So I will not take some sanctimonious positioning from the Greens in relation to this issue, and we won't take a lecture from the Labor Party either, Mr Speaker. In government you put 8,000 children into detention, and we've removed 8,000 children and closed 17 detention centres. But let me make this prediction, because the Leader of the Opposition, Mr Speaker, has still not learnt the lesson. It is still obvious to all Australians that if Labor was elected tomorrow, they would undo the policies of this government. People would be back on boats, kids would be back into detention, and people would be drowning at sea. So not only are we cleaning up Labor's mess, but we are making sure that we stare down the people smugglers, that the Labor Party and the Greens, when they were in government, had not a clue how to deal with the problem. We will not fall for those same mistakes, and we will remain resolute, because what it allows us to do is to have a very compassionate intake of those people who are genuine refugees under the Refugee and Humanitarian Program, including the 12,000 Syrian and Iraqis that we took in over the course of the last couple of years, which would not have been possible. The Australian public would not have supported that decision had the boats still been arriving.
The member for Corangamite.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for the Environment and Energy. Will the minister update the House on action the government is taking to make our energy system more reliable and affordable for hard-working Australian households and businesses? Is the minister aware of any challenges to securing energy reliability and affordability?
The Minister for Energy and the
Thank
environment.
you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Corangamite for her question. I know about her deep concern for businesses in her electorate, like AKD Softwoods, who have seen their gas and electricity prices increase dramatically, and they employ around 300 people in Colac in her electorate. And she, like all those on this side of the House, are committed to putting downward pressure on electricity prices and stabilising our system, cleaning up for the Labor Party's mess by ensuring that more gas is available to the domestic market, abolishing the limited merits review, which the Labor Party now is sending to committee so they can consult their union mates, and getting major concessions from the retailers, which will ensure lower power bills for Australians. Now, I'm asked, are there any challenges to this approach? Well, we know that the Leader of the Opposition, he wasn't the people's choice and no longer is he the workers' choice, Mr Speaker, because he's selling out. He's selling out the blue-collar workers by his commitment to close coal-fired power stations. It's in his election platform, and despite putting on the high-vis vest and going out and saying coal has a future in Australia, he has supported motions in this parliament that says coal has no future in Australia, Mr Speaker. Now, with the Leader of the Opposition with comments like that, you can understand why the member for Port Adelaide is all at sea. Because last week he was interviewed on ABC Breakfast in Melbourne and asked 6 times, do you support keeping open coal-fired power stations or do you support closing them? So Raphael Epstein said, what do you want to do? He said, oh, well, they will close really by virtue of the age. So Epstein asked him again, do you want to encourage them to be open or closed? I'm sure that's not necessarily the right analysis. So Epstein tried again. Do you want to close or open the coal-fired power stations? Member for Port Adelaide, we've got to get that number down. He tried again. Do you want to encourage them to stay open or to close? He couldn't answer it. So then Raphael Epstein said, that's an observation, not a judgment. I'm asking for a judgment. Do you want them to close?
Member for Kingston is warned.
We need to replace coal-fired power with energy and clean energy, Mr Speaker. So there you have it. The member for Port Adelaide, who last week couldn't answer the question 6 times, who last night interviewed on RN Drive couldn't answer the question 9 times, doesn't know whether your policy is to keep coal-fired power stations open or closed. And with advice from the Australian Energy Market Operator that keeping coal-fired power stations is in the interest of Australian consumers, keeping prices lower and the system more stable, the Labor Party should change their policy.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. I'll have another go at the last question. Will the Prime Minister now accept my invitation to write a joint letter to all Australians recommending voting yes to marriage equality?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, I'm interested in the assumption that the Leader of the Opposition makes that joining his signature to mine would actually increase the case for the yes vote. Mr Speaker, the Leader of the Opposition can make his case and I'll make mine.
The member for Forest.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Trade, Tourism and Investment. Will the Minister update the House on the importance of reliable and affordable energy to drive growth in key export industries? Is the Minister aware of any threats to export growth and the jobs that it creates?
The Minister for Trade and Investment.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Forest for a question. Like me, again, the member for Forest is very invested in making sure we continue to open up export markets for Australian businesses. And I was so pleased recently to have the opportunity to go with the member for Forest into her electorate to speak with a number of small exporters that are based in the electorate of Forest, all of whom are contributing, of course, to Australia's multi-billion-dollar export track record. We were in Busselton and Bunbury and had the opportunity to speak to a number of those exporters, including, for example, Churchview Estate Wines in the Margaret River region, all of whom are benefiting from the Coalition's agenda, strong agenda on opening up export market access. And we've seen, particularly from the trifecta of agreements that we've got with Japan, Korea and China, that wine exports are up. In Korea, we've seen wine exports are up some 70%, and exports into China under the China-Australia Free Trade Agreement, which you'd remember they were opposed to until 1 minute to midnight, wine exports to China are up some 38%. But what's crystal clear, though, and the message from the industry, is that in order to be able to remain competitive, to be able to keep exporting, they must have a reliable and stable supply of energy. Now, the Coalition is absolutely committed to that. That's why we've put in place important decisions like the ADGSM to make sure we fix Labor's mess on gas exports. We're also putting in place a reliable supply of electricity. And we saw the Winemakers Federation reinforce this. They said recent increases to price are severely impacting on wine and grape businesses' viability and our ability to compete on a global market. So that's what the wine industry said. So if you want to keep exporting premium wines, or even if you want to export clean skins, reliable energy is crucial. But I've got to say, Mr Speaker, and speaking on clean skins, I came across a pretty interesting article recently, an article in the Sydney Morning Herald about clean skins. And you'll see it says, "Clean skin who can renew Labor." And I thought this is going to be a fascinating article, and it turns out that the clean skin who can renew Labor is a member for Blaxland. And the suggestion was, and look, I'm a big fan of the member for Blaxland. I mean, not as big a fan as the member for Lindsay, but I'm a big fan of the member for Blaxland. And what I know is that I thought, well, perhaps he's got a shot at the title. But the fact is, though, that in this article, the member for Blaxland makes a statement. He says, "I'm not interested in being Prime Minister. Really, the dream job for me is to one day be Education Minister." Now, the member for Sydney isn't here, so maybe there's a chance for Shadow Education Minister, but I want to give one piece of advice to the member for Blaxland. If he wants the top job, he'll have to be very careful, because we've seen that the member for Grainler is willing to shoulder people out of the way to get up there, so I suggest he just bides his time.
The member for Blaxland has the call.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question's to the Prime Minister. This morning on Sky News, the Deputy Prime Minister refused to say whether the government had sought advice on the legality of his ministerial decisions. Has the government sought any advice on the risk of legal challenge if the Deputy Prime Minister, acting as the Minister for Resources, makes the necessary ministerial determination to put gas export controls in place?
Here. Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, I can assure the honourable member that the government is absolutely satisfied that all ministers are exercising their authority within their departments in accordance with their responsibilities, and the minister will make the determination under the domestic gas mechanism at the appropriate time. There is a if honourable members want to listen, as they would know if they've studied the mechanism, there is an elaborate process of fact-finding and consultation that leads up to the making of the decision. But it is also important to recognise that the foreshadowed policy has already had a very beneficial result on gas prices. We've seen a large amounts of additional gas being made available into the market, including announced today by Santos, another 30 petajoules of gas to be supplied into the East Coast domestic market. And as I said earlier, we've seen wholesale spot prices easing substantially since the announcement of the policy was made earlier in the year. So we are taking action that is having the desired effect of making more gas available and bringing down the price of gas, a price that had become very high, unaffordably high, because of the complacency and neglect of the honourable member's party when they were in government. Well, the honourable member. Thank you, Mr Speaker.
The member for Goldstone.
Health. I refer the minister to media reports that show South Australia and the great state of Victoria are facing summer blackouts and major power outages. Why is energy reliability and affordability essential to healthcare services across Australia, and is the minister aware of any risks to delivering these vital and important services?
The Minister for Health.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. You know, Labor are electricity vandals and Labor are hospital vandals. Now, I look by comparison at the member for Goldstein, who spent many years advocating for lower electricity prices and helping to design policies such as the abolition of the carbon tax, which have delivered lower electricity prices. The member for Goldstein, who has done such a tremendous job in supporting new health services in his area, such as the new Holmes Glen 160-bed hospital. But one of the things he remarked on to me at the opening of the new Holmes Glen hospital is that hospitals like this cannot run unless they can afford the electricity through which to provide vital services. And we know in South Australia, South Australian Labor deliberately drove the Northern Power Station out of operation. They didn't just drive it out of operation. They made sure that it was physically blown up. Physically blown up. And you know what? You know what? In so doing, they destroyed the resilience of the South Australian system to the inevitable challenges that come. And so what occurred? What did we see in terms of the impact of this South Australian system on health services in South Australia? Let me quote from the ABC's headline. Embryos, I want you to listen to this.
Members on my left.
Embryos destroyed at Flinders Medical Centre.
The Minister for Health will resume his seat. The Minister for Health will resume his seat. I've warned the member for Kingston. She's interjecting completely uncontrollably. She will leave the chamber under 94A. The Minister for Health has the call.
And so not only did we have that catastrophic outcome, a human outcome, an electricity outcome, an outcome for families, but now you would think that in Victoria they would have learnt the lessons, but instead Victorian Labor deliberately drove 1,600 megawatts of electricity baseload out of the system. And right now Victorian hospitals are paying the price. And the member for Bendigo likes to chat from time to time. The Bendigo Advertiser of the 25th of August. Central Victorian hospitals balking at rising power costs. Castlemaine Health has raised its concerns about the rising cost of energy with the state government, which has been criticised for failing to account for soaring power prices. What we are seeing is that Victoria's hospitals are now facing the same risk as South Australia's hospitals. And all of that at a time when the Leader of the Opposition at the federal level is proposing to double down and introduce a massive new electricity price hike. So they want to increase prices. We've taken steps to reduce them. The Prime Minister has a national energy plan to reduce pressure on gas, reduce pressure on retail and to ensure that we have storage through Snowy 2.0. We want to keep the lights on.
Minister's time has concluded. The member for Isaacs.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Every single day the Prime Minister has to make important decisions on issues critical to the future of our nation. Does the Prime Minister honestly consider there is no issue with the Deputy Prime Minister—
The member for Isaacs will resume his seat. The Minister for Urban Infrastructure will leave under 94A. Member for Isaacs will begin his question again.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Every single day the Prime Minister has to make important decisions on issues critical to the future of our nation. Does the Prime Minister honestly consider there is no issue with leaving the Deputy Prime Minister in charge of the country when there are doubts over his qualifications to even be a member of this parliament? And why will the Prime Minister not answer whether the government has sought advice about the legality under Section 64 of the Deputy Prime Minister's decisions?
The Prime Minister has the call. The Leader of the House is warned. The Prime Minister has the call.
Yes, thank you, Mr Speaker. In accordance with long-standing practice. The Deputy Prime Minister will be acting Prime Minister while I'm overseas, when I'm in Samoa tomorrow. But also in accordance with long-standing practice, as the honourable member knows, as Prime Minister I will continue to make all of those decisions that he referred to, whether I am overseas or indeed at home.
The member for Durack has the call. Members on my left, member for Grayndler. The member for Durack has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Infrastructure and Transport, representing the Minister for Regional Development. Will the Minister update the House on the importance of affordable and reliable energy in regional Australia? What impact would higher electricity prices have on jobs and hard-working families in regional Australia, including those in my electorate of Durack?
The Minister for Infrastructure and Transport, representing the Minister for Regional Development.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker, and I do thank the member for Durack for her question. She is a member who is very much in touch with the real issues in her community, and the member for Durack represents a vast electorate, one where it's focused on issues that really matter to regional Australians. And recently I had the opportunity to visit sections of her electorate, and it's terrific to see work happening on the ground, delivering important infrastructure investment in roads, in rail and in community development projects. Now, there's a long list of achievements, Mr Speaker, for the member for Durack in recent times. She's got the Great Northern Highway upgrades totalling more than $200 million. There's the Northern Australian Roads program, $130 million worth of work underway, the Roads Recovery program, the Heavy Vehicle Safety program, all delivering in her electorate. It's the Turnbull-Joyce government that's delivering for the people of Durack, and as the member indicates, affordable, reliable energy is critical for her community. It's critical for the businesses, it's critical for households in the community of Durack. It seeks to underpin, Mr Speaker, underpin local jobs, growth in regional Western Australia, and also helps to take the pressure off the household cost of living. So I congratulate the member for Durack for the work she's doing on behalf of her electorate, both in Western Australia but here in the federal parliament. Now, Mr Speaker, the Turnbull-Joyce government is delivering on all these fronts right throughout regional WA, and those opposite have been wasting Parliament's time in recent weeks asking questions about citizenship. Just demonstrates how completely out of touch they are with the issues that are impacting on people throughout Australia. Out in the real world, people are coming to us as we move around regional Australia. They're asking us about jobs. They're asking about energy security. They're talking about national security. They're asking about cost of living pressures, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, the question they're asking, though, most of all, is who do you actually trust? Who should they trust to keep delivering for all Australians? I know one thing, Mr Speaker, I know who they can't trust, and that's this Leader of the Opposition or the Labor Party. And why would they trust them? Labor has sold out. They'll go quiet now, Mr Speaker, because they know this is true. They've sold out blue-collar workers for green votes. Sold out blue-collar workers for green votes. They cheered. They cheered when the Hazelwood Power Station closed, Mr Speaker, because that was their policy. That was their policy, contract for closure. They cheered when they closed. If you really want to know how much they care about works, Mr Speaker, the Leader of the Opposition actually donated $100,000 of Australian Workers' Union money to GetUp. Now, the workers, when they paid their union fees, did they know that it'd end up with GetUp? Did they know what GetUp would do with that money? See, this is GetUp. Let's close Australia's dirtiest coal-fired power station. So GetUp gets money from the AWU. GetUp gets money from the AWU to run campaigns against blue-collar workers. That's how the modern Labor Party works. They sell out blue-collar workers for green votes in the city. GetUp wanted Hazelwood to close, and the Labor Party delivered it. GetUp wanted to close, and the Labor Party delivered it. Now, the Leader of the Opposition is very shifty. He can't be trusted with jobs or energy security.
The Manager of Opposition Business can just pause for a second. The members for Lyons and Moreton, both regular customers, will not interject for the rest of question time. They can go back otherwise and shout at their televisions rather than everyone here. The Manager of Opposition Business has the call.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Can the Prime Minister confirm that, owing to doubts over his deputies I beg your pardon. Can he confirm that, owing to doubts over his Deputy Prime Minister, that the Deputy Prime Minister will be acting in name only while Prime Minister? And is there any precedent for this happening?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The arrangements are the same as they have been for many, many years.
The member for Page has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, my question is to the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Agriculture and Water Resources in Northern Australia. Will the Deputy Prime Minister outline how the government is securing the future of agricultural production in Australia and my electorate of Page? And is he aware of any threats to the ongoing viability of hard-working Australian businesses and families in agriculture?
The Deputy Prime Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, I thank the honourable member for his question and note what has the strength of the beef industry and the beef city and how important the beef industry is. And the member for Page would be happy to know that in the most recent GDP figures, the fastest growing sector, the sector that grew that contributed most to the GDP's growth, was agriculture. Agriculture has actually been, under this government, one of the great success stories. In fact, in the time of our government, we've increased the gross output of agriculture by around about 30%. And this is by reason of effective policy, of policies that have been such as the farm management deposits up to $800,000, such as the 100% write-off for water reticulation, the 100% write-off for fencing, the write-off over 3 years for grain storage, the wet rebates, the beef roads, the biosecurity legislation, the country of origin labelling legislation, the sugar code, the regional investment corporation, decentralisation, the building of dog fences, the inland rail. All this goes to show a government that believes in agriculture, yet the Labor opposition, we don't even know what they have, whether they have a policy in agriculture. They don't believe in agriculture. They have no reason to stand behind one of the pillars of our economy. They've shown no interest in agriculture. In fact, generally the shadow Minister for Agriculture never even gets a question, unless it's a question on anything but agriculture. Now, you asked if there's a threat, and there are a lot of threats, but the biggest threat to agriculture is power prices. Definitely power prices. And it's rather sad when we find that the member for Maribyrnong turns his back on the Australian people, turns his back on coal workers, turns his back on those in the high-vis suits. He doesn't believe in workers anymore. He's turned his back on those who actually labour. The leader of the Labor Party no longer believes in labourers, and you can see he turns his back on them because he just doesn't believe them. And it says someone else who doesn't believe in labourers. And it's sad to see Sally McManus, the leader of the ACT, who said today, when asked about Liddell, it's just a matter of time and this plant will close. Well, what Sally McManus meant to say, it's just a matter of time and these labourers will lose their job. And that is where the Labor Party has gone. They have given up on labourers, given up on workers. The Labor Party has turned their back on workers and they've turned towards Balmain, they've turned towards Annandale, they've turned towards Woolloomooloo, but they've turned the back on the people who once were the proud bones of the Australian Labor Party. And at one time we are going to get the member for Maribyrnong. He will come to the dispatch box and say he believes in those coal miners' jobs, because they are watching this and they are giving up on you. They are giving up on the Labor Party because they know the Labor Party has given up on them.
Member for Greenway, the Manager of Opposition Business.
Thanks, Speaker. I move that so much of the standing and sessional orders be suspended as would prevent the Manager of Opposition Business from moving the following motion immediately. The House 1. Notes the House has unanimously asked the High Court to determine if the Deputy Prime Minister was ever validly elected to Parliament. B. The government refuses to release the Solicitor-General's advice on which the entire legitimacy of his government rests. C. The government refuses to even state whether it has sought advice on the risk to legal challenge to the Deputy Prime Minister's ministerial decisions. D. Significant ministerial decisions of the Deputy Prime Minister are being delayed, including decisions which would bring power prices down for Australians. And E. Despite the current doubts over the legality of the Deputy Prime Minister's ministerial actions, tomorrow the Prime Minister will risk the entire legitimacy of the government by leaving the Deputy Prime Minister in charge of the nation. And 2. Therefore calls on the Prime Minister to A. Direct his Deputy Prime Minister to immediately stand aside, and B. Stop abusing the trust of the Australian people by being so reckless with the leadership of the nation. Was there ever an occasion when a Prime Minister said
the Leader of the House?
Mr Speaker, I move the member be no longer heard.
The Leader of the House has moved the Manager of Opposition Business be no further heard. All those of that opinion say aye. Aye. The contrary, no. If the ayes have it, division required. Ring the bells for 4 minutes. Lock the doors. The question is the Manager of Opposition Business be no further heard. The ayes will pass to the right of the chair, the noes to the left. Put the honourable members for Murray and Gray tell us for the ayes, and the honourable members for Morton and Lawler tell us for the noes. Order. The result of the division is ayes 72, no 62. The question is therefore resolved in the affirmative. Is the motion seconded? The member for Hunter.
Second the motion, Mr Speaker. Today the Prime Minister expressed no confidence in
the Leader of the House.
Be no longer heard.
The Leader of the House has moved that the member for Hunter be no further heard. All those of that opinion say aye. The contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. Division required. Ring the bells for 1 minute. I appoint the same tellers as the previous division. As always, it would be helpful if members were to remain in their seats during this successive division unless they're leaving the chamber or they did not vote in the previous division, in which case they must report to the tellers. Lock the doors. The question is the member for Hunter be no further heard. Members must remain in their seats unless they're changing their vote or did not vote in the previous division, in which case they must report to the tellers. Order. The result of the division is ayes 72, no 62. The question is therefore resolved in the affirmative. The question is that the motion moved by the Manager of Opposition Business be agreed to. All those of that opinion say aye. To the contrary, no. I think the noes have it. Division required. Ring the bells for 1 minute, but the tellers will do a full count. Lock the doors. The question is that the motion moved by the Manager of Opposition Business be agreed to. The ayes will pass to the right of the chair, the noes to the left. I appoint the honourable members for Lawler and Morton. Tellers for the ayes, and the honourable members for Gray and Murray. Tellers for the noes. Order. The result of the division is ayes 62, noes 72. The question is therefore negatived. Members can take their seats. We can resume question time. The member for Boothby.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Defence Industry, representing the Minister for Employment. I refer the minister to reports this week that trade unions now hold over $1 billion of assets, despite falling union membership. How has this increase in funding resulted in improved services to members of these registered organisations?
Members on my left, the Minister for Defence Industry, representing the Minister for Industrial Relations.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Boothby for her question. Mr Speaker, once again Simon Benson at the Australian newspaper has written a story today about the practice of some unions to negotiate terms in enterprise agreements that identify a compulsory income protection, redundancy, training or similar fund that then pays kickbacks to the union. This is how unions have managed to grow, Mr Speaker, in terms of their assets substantially over the years, despite their membership dwindling. Members will know that their membership's now fallen to 10% in the private sector, yet their funds keep increasing. One example of this type of arrangement is a deal between the AWU Victoria and Income Protection Fund IUS Holdings. Evidence to the Royal Commission into Trade Union Governance Corruption shows that significant payments from various companies to the Victorian branch of the AWU between 2003 and 2007 went ahead. The Leader of the Opposition ran the union at this time, Mr Speaker. He was Victorian Secretary until August 2006 and National Secretary until November 2007. Payments to the AWU, Mr Speaker, by IUS Holdings over that period were 20 separate payments, resulting in $566,000 paid to the AWU Victorian branch in that period, Mr Speaker. And yet there is absolutely no evidence whatsoever of what those payments were for, and they were not disclosed to the workers, Mr Speaker. And coincidentally, Mr Speaker, over the same period that this $566,000 of 20 secret payments were being made, the AWU Victoria signed 28 enterprise agreements that insisted that IUS Holdings be the income protection insurance provider for those workers paid by the businesses into the IUS Holdings Fund, Mr Speaker. So in return for those kickbacks that the union was paid, while the Leader of the Opposition was the Secretary, IUS was insisted that IUS be the income protection provider in 28 enterprise agreements. A very, very clear case of a conflict of interest, a very clear case, Mr Speaker, of corrupting benefits payments being made to the AWU Victoria during that period by IUS Holdings, Mr Speaker. The Leader of the Opposition has never explained what these payments are for, and he really needs to take the opportunity to do so. He needs to explain what the purpose of the payments and to what purpose the payments were put within the union.
The Manager of Opposition Business.
My question is to the Prime Minister. Can the Prime Minister confirm that John Anderson had the authority as Acting Prime Minister to convene Cabinet to consider ANZUS being invoked in 2001, and that the statement today from the Prime Minister is the first time Australia will have an acting PM in name only? If the Prime Minister doesn't trust him to do the job, why won't he stand the deputy aside?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The invocation of the ANZUS Treaty after 9/11 was made by Prime Minister John Howard in the United States of America. Prime Ministers discharge the duties of their office wherever they are in the world. Liberal Prime Ministers, Labor Prime Ministers for many, many years. Honourable members opposite know that. They know that's the practice. They know that's the practice of my government and indeed as it was of the governments in which many of those opposite were ministers.
The member for Right jump first.
I thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Immigration and Border Protection. Will the Minister update the House on the action the government is taking to protect Australian families from dangerous visa holders, including criminal gangs?
The Minister for Immigration and Border Protection.
Well, Mr Speaker, I want to thank the member for Wright very much for his question. And like everybody on this side of the House, he's working very hard in his electorate to keep his community safe, and he should be commended for that. It's certainly the case, Mr Speaker, that this government has cancelled a record number of— well, it's a very interesting interjection from the member for Grainler, questioning the Labor Party's track record when they were in government, because, as it turns out,
under
this government, Mr Speaker, we have increased the number of visa cancellations by 1,200% of those people, non-citizens, who have committed serious crimes against Australian citizens. Under the Labor government, many of those people who had committed serious crimes went on to become Australian citizens. So the difference in approach here, not only in relation to the cancellation of these visas, but also on border protection matters, could be no more stark than the examples that I've provided, Mr Speaker. Now, we have cancelled the outlaw motorcycle gang members, 150 in total. 150 in total, Mr Speaker. Now, there are members of the CFMEU I see that are interjecting opposite, who aren't in favour of the cancellation of visas of outlaw motorcycle gang members. I mean, that's quite a startling revelation from the member interjecting. You know why the CFMEU don't like the bikies being cancelled? Because they're the muscle on the building sites that are breaking the arms of the carpenters and the plumbers who refuse to sign their members up to the CFMEU. So what a surprise that the members opposite would be against this. And it goes to show, Mr Speaker, it goes to show just how much control the CFMEU and other militant unions have over this Leader of the Opposition. They have enormous power. Not Bob Hawke, not Kevin Rudd, not Julia Gillard ever, in any circumstance, could people point to the level of influence that is exerted over this Leader of the Opposition. And yet this man, Mr Speaker, wants to be Prime Minister of this country, and we know—
The Minister will resume his seat. The Manager of Opposition Business on a point of order.
On direct relevance, Mr Speaker.
The Minister will come back to the dispatch box. In the time left, he will confine himself to the substance of the question.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. So I'm asked about the cancellation of dangerous visa holders, including criminal gang members. There are 150, as I say, of the bikies that we've cancelled, those involved in outlaw motorcycle gangs. They are the biggest distributors of ice and amphetamine in our country. So families in rural communities and cities around the country who are worried about the scourge of drugs on the streets blame the outlaw motorcycle gang members. What do they do in their part-time? In their part-time work, they are involved in extortion and work on building sites where they work for the CFMEU. The CFMEU is directly in control of this Leader of the Opposition who wants to be Prime Minister of this country. It couldn't be any more direct, Mr Speaker. The fact is that this Leader of the Opposition, unlike any of his predecessors—
Minister will just pause for a second. The member for Lyons will withdraw, and he can now do as I predicted earlier, leave the chamber. The Minister has the call.
In closing, Mr Speaker, there is a perfect exhibit as he walks out of the chamber of somebody who is completely controlled by the union movement.
The Minister will resume his seat. The Manager of Opposition Business.
On impugning a motive to a Member of Parliament, I ask that comment be withdrawn.
Yes, the Minister will withdraw.
I withdraw.
A member for Isaacs.
My question is to the Prime Minister. Thank you, Mr Speaker. The Prime Minister is attending the Pacific Islands Forum in Samoa tomorrow. How can the Prime Minister allow the Deputy Prime Minister to be acting Prime Minister when we don't even know if he's constitutionally qualified to be a member of this Parliament? Why is the Prime Minister abusing the trust of the Australian people by being so reckless with the leadership of the nation?
The member for Barker will cease interjecting. The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr Speaker. That question too has a very familiar ring, and I refer the honourable member to my earlier answer.
The member for Banks.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Veterans Affairs. Will the minister inform the House on action the government is taking to aid defence personnel in their transition to civilian life, particularly with employment?
The Minister for Veterans Affairs.
I'd like to thank the member for Banks for his question and acknowledge his ongoing support for our defence personnel and veterans. As the Prime Minister has said, the best way we can honour the service and sacrifice of the diggers of 100 years ago is to make sure that we're looking after the veterans of today. The Turnbull government is continuing to work to improve the transition of our separating ADF personnel and to ensure that they have meaningful opportunities in civilian life. Veterans are some of the most highly skilled members of the workforce and have much to offer the business community. They bring not just their technical skills but also values such as leadership, resilience, agility and the ability to operate in complex environments. The Prime Minister's Veterans Employment Initiative, announced in November 2016 with the support of the opposition, and we thank them for that, helps industry recognise and connect with that talent. This is not charity. This is about encouraging business to make a smart business decision. Yesterday, the chair of the programme's Industry Advisory Committee, George Frassis, and the Prime Minister launched the inaugural Prime Minister's Veterans Employment Awards to celebrate Australian businesses and the veterans who are making a significant contribution to their workplace. The awards include 9 categories covering businesses of all sizes, employees and businesses employing our ADF spouses, a very important category. We also launched a practical toolkit to support veterans to enter the Australian public service. After all, government has a role to play in this program as a significant employer in Australia as well. The government has already added a Defence Force experience desirable flag to the Job Active website, resulting in more than 1,500 jobs being advertised. I would like to take this opportunity to thank the members of the Industry Advisory Committee for their ongoing work in this area, and I look forward to continuing to work with them. I would also like to thank the opposition for their bipartisanship on this issue. As they have said, this program is a long-term legacy to be continued by all governments in the future. In particular, and she's not here, I'd like to thank the Shadow Minister, who has offered to send out the Shell press release to all the members on that side as well, so that we can have all members in this place advertise this initiative right round Australia. For those who want to learn more on the program, go to veteransemployment.gov.au. Prime Minister, can I commend you for this initiative and this announcement yesterday, and it tops off what I think has been an excellent week.
Just before I call the Prime Minister, I just say to the Minister I let him run overtime because, as I've said to the House, where it's a sensitive subject, we allow it to run overtime. So if that happens again, I appreciate he just leave the last bit out. It doesn't relate to the substance. The Prime Minister.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I ask that further questions be placed on the notice paper.